Hey everyone, welcome back. As the US is getting closer and closer to defaulting on its debt, President Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy are getting ready to meet on Tuesday in order to begin negotiating on the issue of raising the debt ceiling. Now, back in mid-March, I made a video where I said that President Biden had essentially won these negotiations before he started, but since then, a lot of things have happened. Most importantly, the House has released and passed its own bill, which essentially serves as the House Republicans' opening position for this negotiation. So, I figured we should revisit the issue, take stock of both sides' opening positions, and again try and figure out which side has the stronger opening position in negotiations over increasing the debt ceiling. Since President Biden put out his opening position first, let's start there. And to be completely honest, it hasn't really changed since the last video I made. President Biden has consistently stated that he is not willing to negotiate over the debt ceiling, but that he is more than happy to talk about the budget and enter into negotiations about what government spending should look like going forward. And that's a pretty good position. After all, these two things are entirely separate. The debt ceiling has to do with money that we've already spent, whereas the budget, well, that's the money that we will spend in the future. And yes, there are plenty of arguments to be made about future spending, but not paying our debts, that's something that he's not willing to budge on. And to be frank, it's a very good opening position, especially since Republicans were more than happy to raise the debt ceiling 3 times under President Trump without asking for any of the cuts that they're currently asking for. And you can imagine the political ads essentially write themselves about how Republicans don't actually care about the debt ceiling, they just care about causing an economic catastrophe when there's a Democrat in the White House. And that sort of messaging is probably going to do pretty well with those moderate and independent voters that are so important to winning modern elections. Now let's turn to Speaker McCarthy and the House Republicans' opening position. They managed to finally get a bill passed by the smallest majority possible that would essentially raise the debt ceiling in exchange for some pretty significant government spending cuts. All federal spending would be reduced to 2022 levels, and all future growth would be capped at 1% per year. Additionally, there were provisions to essentially undo the vast majority of President Biden's legislative accomplishments for the first 2 years of his term. Now, while the bill did pass, immediately after they passed it, a lot of Republicans started taking heat for the bill. You had more moderate Republicans who were in swing districts hearing from their constituents that they were unhappy with all of the cuts they were seeing to veterans' benefits, border security, defense spending, federal law enforcement, farm subsidies, children's health care, etc. And on the other side, you had more extreme Republicans saying that this bill didn't go far enough and that they wanted even more cuts. And Kevin McCarthy managed to talk out of both sides of his mouth to get them to pass the bill by saying that this is only a starting point. But when the moderates heard that, they heard, this is a starting point. The cuts will not be this draconian. And when the more extreme Republicans heard that, they heard, there will be more cuts than this. The cuts will get bigger. And that inherent dichotomy is going to make Kevin McCarthy's negotiating position really weak, because he really is going to have a hard time tying these two groups together, because he's got moderates saying that we need the cuts to be smaller, and he's got more extreme Republicans, kind of the MAGA Freedom Caucus types, that are saying we need the cuts to be bigger. And he can't do both. And given that he had no margin for error when he passed this the first time, I don't see where he's going to get the votes to pass anything that deviates from this. And to be quite honest, I don't think he could even pass it again if he tried, just because so many people heard from their constituents that this was not the bill they wanted. So, given these two opening positions, it's pretty obvious that Democrats have the upper hand in this negotiation. Biden's position has something for everybody. The Democrats obviously get to raise the debt ceiling and take that political win. Voters get to avoid the economic catastrophe that would result from a U.S. default. And Republicans get the opportunity to have this fight again come September 30th and to threaten a government shutdown. Now, government shutdowns are still bad, but they're not nearly as catastrophic as a default would be, and both parties have done them in the past. So it's not like it's uncommon to American politics. So Republicans still get some place where they can continue to fight with Democrats, and it's even a little bit closer to 2024, so it could help them put out a political message going into a major election cycle. So, while not everybody gets everything they want, everyone's interests are at least met somewhat. Nobody walks away completely empty-handed. Meanwhile, not even all Republicans are behind Kevin McCarthy's position, and given the disagreements he has between the opposite wings of his party, he doesn't really have any room to negotiate. If he concedes some things to Biden, Marjorie Taylor Greene will be racing down to the House floor to file a motion to vacate the chair and remove Kevin McCarthy as Speaker. But if McCarthy goes further to the right and caters to the MAGA wing of his party, those moderate Republicans in swing districts just aren't going to be able to vote for that and stand any chance of being reelected. So they're probably not going to support that measure either. So Kevin McCarthy really doesn't have a lot of operating room within his own caucus to negotiate. And if he tries to work with Democrats, he's very likely to lose that speaker's chair. So I really don't think there's going to be a negotiated settlement between McCarthy and Biden. Now, just because negotiations don't look likely to succeed doesn't mean that we're inevitably going to see a U.S. default. To paraphrase the great Lin-Manuel Miranda, it's all about the room where it happens, and who knows what's going to happen when President Joe Biden and Speaker McCarthy meet on Tuesday. So we'll just have to wait and see how that meeting pans out. However, looking at everything going on right now, the best path forward for everybody involved might actually be the Democrats' attempt to use a discharge petition in the House of Representatives to raise the debt ceiling. A discharge petition essentially allows a majority of the members of the House of Representatives to force a vote on a bill over the objections of the Speaker of the House, who would normally decide what bills come up for a vote. In this case, Democrats have been setting up all the procedural steps for this since early January, and are now getting ready for the final step, which requires them to get the signatures of a majority of the members, which means they need the signatures of 5 Republicans. But this really might make everyone happy, because Democrats will be able to push through some kind of debt ceiling raise. They might come with an attached commission to study the issue of government spending, which gives a little bit of cover for swing district Republicans so that they can say, we're still looking at the debt, and it's still a big problem, but we wanted to work in a bipartisan fashion to prevent an economic catastrophe that would occur if the U.S. defaulted on its debt. So both of those sides have their interests met. Kevin McCarthy also gets to hang on to his speaker chair because, well, it's not his fault. He couldn't stop this. He wouldn't have brought it up for a vote. And all of the MAGA Republicans get to vote against it. So, in the House, everybody wins. The bill would then move on to the Senate, and there have been some senators, such as Mike Lee, who said that they would filibuster this if it managed to make its way to the Senate. But given that Republicans have a very good map for themselves in 2024, making themselves the obvious source of a government default would be political malpractice, if not worse. So, I'm sure that if the discharge petition were to work in the House, Mitch McConnell would make sure that the votes necessary to override any foolish filibuster would be there, and that Democrats would be able to vote for the bill, all Republicans would vote against it, as is tradition, and the bill would make its way to President Biden's desk, who would then sign it. Again, everybody gets what they want. Republicans get to say, well, we oppose raising the debt ceiling because we still think there needs to be, reining in of government spending and all of that. Democrats get to avoid an economic collapse. Voters are obviously happy because they don't suffer an economic collapse. And President Biden gets to chalk up a win and say, yeah, I worked in a bipartisan manner with members of the House, both Republicans and Democrats, and avoided having to negotiate with the MAGA Republicans, and we've averted this crisis. And then we'll repeat this circus in some way, shape, or form around September 30th when it comes time for a government shutdown. But at least then the economic impact won't be quite as severe as it would be if we suffered a government default. So, yeah, I wouldn't expect to see too much coming out of Tuesday's meeting. Neither side really has any incentive to negotiate, and when it comes to Kevin McCarthy, he doesn't even seem to have any room to negotiate within his caucus, so it's not very likely that him and Joe Biden are going to be able to come to an acceptable negotiated agreement. However, the Democrat strategy to use the discharge petition to solve this issue does actually seem decently likely to succeed, as it meets everybody's interests, at least acceptably. And that's interesting, to me at least, because it shows that Republicans managed to create this crisis that did not need to exist, And then, in order to get out of it, they're relying on the Democrats to bail them out. Think about it.